Hello and welcome to my presentation on New England culture. My name is Anthony Ochoa Fader, and I'll be guiding you through the various aspects of New England culture and what makes New England culture so influential not only in the United States but in a global context. First of all, who am I? I am Anthony Ochoa Fader. I am one of the teachers of the Verano and Invierno Puma courses with UNAM Boston, and I'm also a student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, an anthropology student. So let's go over some geography. New England is in the United States, obviously, and it is in the Northeast. Not only the Northeast, but the most north and the most east. It is made up of 6 states, which I will go through in a second, but just to give you a sense of the geography here, it is a long way from Mexico and Mexico City. The climate is very different. It's a lot colder, as you can imagine, a lot more arboreal, and there's a lot of snow in the winter. A lot of snow. So a very different environment. So the cultural influence of New England really cannot be understated. This was one of the original colonies settled in North America, what would later become the United States. This was the second kind of part of the country that was settled, and it really heavily defined the culture of the nation early on. It was one of the wealthier centers of trade, of commerce, and it has had a long-standing influence on the politics and the culture of this country, and thus by extension the world. So the New England region is made up of 6 states, as we can see on this map here: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. So these states are all bordering one another, and they all have a common history together. They were all settled by the same group of people. These people are the Puritans. We will get to them in a moment. And throughout their colonial history, and even to this day, they have had a very close relationship with one another. Today, as it has always been, Boston is by far the largest city in the region, Boston, Massachusetts, and it has really kind of been the epicenter of New England culture for as long as New England has been a name, given to a region. So Boston is extremely important to the story of New England. It kind of goes like Boston culture becomes New England culture, becomes United States culture, and, from there, who knows. So just to give you an idea of how kind of influential Boston is as not only a cultural force in New England, but in the United States and again the world, the story of the word okay. So you may think to yourself, oh, okay, that's probably been in English, forever, right? That must be an ancient word. But no, not at all. It's actually a fairly new word. And it started as Boston slang. This was not in Shakespeare's day, right? This is a new invention, and it was slang originally. So in the 19th century, the 1800s, in the United States, it was a kind of popular meme, kind of joke to misspell phrases, spell them incorrectly, and then abbreviate them. So you'd use an abbreviation, and someone would be like, what is that abbreviation? I've never heard of that before. And then you'd be like, well, it stands for this, and it would be an incorrect spelling. And everyone, I guess, thought that was funny back in the day. Humor maybe does not age the best from history. But the word okay is one such abbreviation. It originally was an abbreviated form of all correct. As I'm sure you guys know, the English language is a bit strange, and words, letters, can have multiple different pronunciations depending on the context that they're in the sentence, if it's a loan word from another language, and just because sometimes English is weird, right? So it was a phonetic misspelling of all correct, meaning that it sounded, like all correct, but it was spelled with an O and a K. It became abbreviated as OK, and then the word we know it today, you can spell it O-K-A-Y, and people know what you mean. But it originally, was just these two letters, and it goes back to Boston in 1839, which is a long time ago by today's standards, but, in terms of global history, quite new. And that's kind of, this story should go to show how this thing, which might have seemed universal or like it's always been there, was not always there, and it came from New England. So New England culture. The culture of New England has been radically shaped by the region's history and geography. So, as I mentioned before, the original settlers of this land, of New England, came here, and obviously when I say original, we all know that there were people living here for centuries before the native people. I meant to say the original European settlers of this land were deeply religious people, very, very deeply religious. This was not kind of the state of England saying, hey, let's go colonize the new world. This was not the King of England saying this. This was a group of religious dissidents, people who were persecuted in England and decided to make the long and hard journey of going to the Americas in order to kind of start a new life for themselves and to enact their, frankly, unpopular religious beliefs on this new land. And it's defined by that kind of religiosity, but also that sense of, we are really an oppressed group in some ways, and we are going to go found this new kind of democratic society. Those two things are not always play well together, but that was kind of the initial contradiction, really, of the settlement of the United States. And the Puritans kind of embody that contradiction between, rights for all people, but also kind of do what I say. So it's defined by that kind of history, and also the fact that it is a coastal region. The Atlantic Ocean has had a really, really, really profound effect on the colonies, going back, centuries. Since the very beginning, fishing and whaling have been prominent industries, and maritime trade, was huge for the colonies. To give you an idea, in Cuba, during colonial times, there were obviously, a customs house there for the Spanish, and there would be a record of whatever boats came in. A boat came in today from England, you write that down. A boat came in from France, you write that down. Boston, just the city of Boston itself, had its entire own designation. Not in the, an English boat here came here today, but a Boston ship came here today and traded with us. So that kind of goes to show how active New England merchants were in the oceans at this time. Here we have another illustration of some Puritans, otherwise known as pilgrims. And you may think to yourself, hold on, these guys look a little bit familiar. Where do I know them from? This is them being, religious in one of their churches. And you might know them from the Salem witch trials. So if you've ever heard of these before, these were some really famous, I don't know how else to phrase it, bogus courtroom decisions in colonial New England, in the state of Massachusetts, what's now Massachusetts. And the town of Salem thought that a bunch of women there were witches, and they tried them and hung them for being witches. It's a quite dark story, actually, but it's well known throughout the world. If you've ever seen the movie Hocus Pocus, takes place in Salem, right? Just going back a second here, this is, again, the Puritans, deeply religious. It informed every kind of aspect of their lives. They weren't just passively into God, right? They were extremely fervent in their belief. Here we have the port of Boston, a really old depiction of it. You can see ships coming in and out. And, this kind of maritime trade aspect continued well into the 19th century. And here we have even a photograph of boats coming in and out. And these are smaller boats, but you can see, all of these factories and stuff lined up. This was a bustling port town. And a depiction of whaling. New England whalers literally went around the world, to the Sea of Japan, as far as to go and find whales to kill for their blubber. Oh, and here, just to give you an idea of how kind of extremely influential fishing and maritime seafood was to the New England region, this is the sacred cod. This is a giant wooden fish that was carved, and it was placed in the center of the Massachusetts State House. So whenever the state Congress and state government kind of meets to discuss and pass legislation, there's always a giant wooden fish above their heads. And it's called the sacred cod, and it's meant to kind of be like, oh cod, thank you so much for giving us your bountiful, catches to, save us from the brutal New England winters. We're going to honor you by putting up a giant wooden replica of you, and we're always going to remember you, codfish. Never forget. So, New England democracy. New England has a long history of participatory government. So the Puritans were Protestant Christians, they were not Catholics, and these Puritans believed that everyone had a special personal relationship with God. This meant that individuals were entitled to certain rights, chief among them to the Puritans, the right to own property, but also to kind of have a say in their communities, have a say in how things were run. Again, this was not the king of England sending people over to start, a colony for his kingdom. These were commoners, these were common people who came across the ocean to settle and make a communal commonwealth, as it was known, commonwealth. So aboard their first voyage to the New World, on the boat itself, the colonists wrote a document called the Mayflower Compact. It was named after the ship. The ship was named the Mayflower. And this document was the first kind of written charter of government in what would later become the United States. It's a really important text, and it pledges that everyone who signs will act in the general good of the colony. So again, it was known as a commonwealth, and this was meant to be not a hierarchical society, but one where everyone pitched in and did their part. Excuse me. So every community, going back to the very first colony, had a town hall. And these town halls would be big buildings where the people of that community would come and they would vote on legislation. They would have their say in how the community was run. And this was pretty unheard of because there weren't kind of, feudal lords around in the Americas to say, hey, I own this land, do what I say. This was a chance for communities to have real control over their land and how it was kind of used. And yeah, common people were allowed to have a voice in government. And one reason why the eventual American War for Independence was so successful was because the people of New England and throughout the other colonies, but especially in New England, already had a kind of heritage, a culture of democratic participatory government, going back from the very beginning. Now, I do want to say all of that sounds very nice, and indeed it was very progressive in many ways for its time. But do not get it twisted, because there are lots of limitations to this kind of idea of democracy. It may be, everyone in the community has a say, but who is considered to be in the community and who isn't is a big source of tension. Before we go, this is the signing of the Mayflower Compact. Again, the first kind of written article of government signed by colonies that would later become the United States. Really important legal document for this country, and is kind of a really bold statement of wanting to work together to create a communal society. And here we have a picture of town halls today. People still go to town halls. They in many communities they're run exactly how they were hundreds of years ago. They function the exact same way, and we have people voting right now on some sort of legislation. I will go back a second here and show you this image is of Faneuil Hall, and Faneuil Hall was a meeting house in the city of Boston, and it is where some of the original revolutionary leaders convinced the public to go for revolution. So here we have a statue to a man named Samuel Adams. He was a founding father of the United States, and he had a lot of speeches and gave a lot of oratory kind of messages to people in Faneuil Hall, this meeting house. And it was the action that kind of radicalized the city and made them revolt against the king later. So really important kind of side of things. But an even more important side of things is to remember that all of this kind of progressive sounding experiments in democracy was all happening with the backdrop of indigenous genocide. The colonists did not extend the idea of human rights to the indigenous people who, again, had been on this land for centuries. This was their home. This is all they had never known. And the colonists came, they took that land, and they slaughtered. They slaughtered the natives here. I know it's a bit gruesome, but I don't want to sugarcoat it. As some educators do, this was a very violent time. So the Puritans believed that they were God's chosen people, again, very deeply religious. And they thought that they were kind of the chosen people, and that these Indians, they called them savages for being pagan, and they said that they didn't really have a place in their community. So again, we see within the community, progressive, lots of rights that would not be extended to the people of Europe for many more centuries, very democratic, but only if you are a, white European settler. This was not extended to the indigenous people. New England colonists used all sorts of manners to kind of subjugate the native population. They would get the indigenous people to sign bogus land contracts that the indigenous people did not really fully understand, and were basically a trick to get native people to give away their land for very little. And the colonists did not really kind of hold up their side of any trade they did with the indigenous people. And of course, there was outright war. There were outright wars declared on the various people, and eventually they were really kind of subjugated underneath the colonies. And just a small thing I want to mention, slavery, African slavery, was never really particularly popular in the North. It was definitely much more prevalent in the South. So New England didn't really have a lot to do with having slaves in the country. But absolutely, if you recall, New England merchants are sailing around the Atlantic during the Atlantic slave trade. They absolutely participated in the slave trade and really made money from the subjugation of African slaves and, again, of the indigenous people. There's kind of a common story that people in the United States like to tell about themselves and act as though the kind of colonization was really peaceful, but this is simply inaccurate. We have here a illustration of what's called the First Thanksgiving. It shows, the pilgrims handing out food to natives. And of course, obviously this did happen in some capacity for certain occasions, but certainly after a while, once the colonies were really well entrenched, it was not friendly like this at all. This gives a very false impression that the kind of transfer from one group to another was peaceful, but it absolutely was not. Here we have something closer to the truth of colonists in a battle with Native Americans. But the indigenous people were not totally subjugated. And there are still two big communities of indigenous people from the Wampanoag Nation in Massachusetts, just Massachusetts. And there are other indigenous tribes in other states, in New England, of course. I'm just going to focus on this today. But these two communities have their own governments, they provide their own public services, and their communities are dedicated to preserving their culture and not only keeping it alive in their own communities, but trying to educate people about the history of colonization and let people know a little bit more and more about their culture. Because again, Americans are pretty uninformed of kind of how violent their past is sometimes, and so education like this really goes a long way. Now, moving on to kind of contemporary culture, even though the original settlers of New England were very religious, today the region is the least religious part of the country. It's kind of a crazy twist of fate, right? The part of the country that was the most religious, the most bigoted, has become the least religious and very progressive in certain ways. Less than half of the people polled in New England said that religion was an important part of their life. I mean, that's a pretty steep number for the United States. And about one of every four people said they had no religion at all, which is pretty, again, unique for the United States. And here I have a picture of a church steeple with the LGBT flag. Not to say that the church and LGBT community are always at odds, they aren't at all. And in fact, we see that in this image. We see kind of how even though religion is not as deeply kind of ingrained in the society anymore, it's still very important, and the churches have kept up with the times. This is a perfect segue into a discussion of progressive politics, because New England has historically been one of the most progressive regions in the country. In the 19th century, when slavery was really big in the United States, New England was kind of the home of the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements. And in fact, it was kind of pressure from New England and the North that led to the Civil War, indirectly. And so, for a long time, New England has had really progressive politics, and this is kind of really exemplified in the fact that we were the first state in the Union. Massachusetts was the first state in the Union to legalize gay marriage. And not only was it the first state to do so, it was the sixth place in the world, counting other countries, right? I think the Netherlands was before us, and a few other places, I think Quebec as well. But, sixth in the world ain't bad for a plucky little state. And the activists who won this victory in Massachusetts would go on to help, motivate other movements across the country as well. And this state was instrumental in getting gay marriage legalized on a federal level as well. And we were also the ninth state to legalize cannabis use. Not as important or profound as the gay marriage one, but just goes to show kind of the vibes of the region. And here we have a picture from that day in 2004 when Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage. Education. If you know the region of New England, one of the things you might know about it is that there are a lot of schools here. Even back in Puritan times, the Puritans were really concerned with education. Education was seen as essential for a democratic society and a moral society. So, for instance, Boston, again, it all kind of comes back to Boston, has a lot of universities in it. Over 50 colleges with 250,000 students enrolled in all of them. That is a lot of students. That is a lot of universities. It's kind of crazy. I live in Boston, and if I walk down the street just in a straight line, I will pass not 3 but 4 different universities within like 5 miles. It's kind of crazy. And graduates from Boston and, of course, all of New England have gone on to be extremely influential in the world, not just the United States, but the world. Nobel Prize laureates and Congress members and presidents, not just of the United States, but of other countries, presidents of other countries, some of them went to school in New England. And the school they most likely went to, if they're the president of another country, is Harvard. You've all heard of Harvard. It is widely considered one of the greatest universities in the world. And it was originally funded by the Puritans. It was founded to be a religious school, specifically in order to train Puritan priests. Obviously, it is no longer a clerical school today, but that's how it started. And eventually it would kind of change and morph over time to be the huge institution that we know today, with a bunch of different degrees and everything from, the social sciences to mathematics to natural sciences, a bunch of different topics, everything you could want. And it also has a reputation for being very expensive. Again, the endowment for Harvard is $50 billion. That's a billion with a B. $50 billion for this school, for this one school. So it has a reputation for being a bit fresa, as they say. Art and literature are also extremely important in New England. There are many world-famous museums here in Boston and throughout the New England region, and many world-famous authors and poets came from New England. Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, you might know from The Raven, H.P. Lovecraft, the Cthulhu guy, and Dr. Seuss. Who doesn't like Dr. Seuss? That's what I want to know. Sports. Sports are extremely, extremely popular in New England. It's everyone's favorite pastime, and there are a few teams that have made national kind of acclaim for how good they are. The Boston Red Sox are a really famous kind of old Boston team. A lot of older people really enjoy baseball. It's not as popular anymore, but it's certainly very influential and historical. The New England Patriots, considered one of the best American football teams in the NFL, and the Boston Celtics for basketball, and Boston Bruins for ice hockey. These are some names you might have heard of before, possibly. And one thing to note is that basketball was invented in Massachusetts, one of the states of New England. So next time you play or watch basketball, just know it is from New England. Same with volleyball as well. Medicine. Medicine is huge, again, in Boston and New England as a whole. There are 25 hospitals just in Boston alone, and some of these are world famous. The Massachusetts General Hospital, and particularly the Boston's Children's Hospital, are considered some of the best hospitals in the world, period. Particularly Boston Children's Hospital, which I have pictured here, extremely influential and very well respected. It tops many lists for best pediatric hospital in the world. And in Massachusetts, the very first use of anesthetic was used. So you can thank New England next time you go to the dentist and they knock you out with Novocaine. You can say, thank God, for New England. Food. The food of New England is very different from the food of Mexico in many ways. New England is known for, of course, seafood, and it inherits a taste for very mild food. I don't think there's a single traditional food from New England that is even slightly spicy. Like, probably not even black pepper. That's how mild these dishes are. But they make up for it by using really fresh, incredible ingredients. And, lobster can only taste so bad, right? So some traditional foods, lobster rolls, which are pictured here. These are sandwiches of lobster, clam chowder, which is a soup made from clams and potatoes. New England cider, apple cider, is really popular. It is a really nice alcoholic drink. There are lots of seasonal ciders that are made each harvest in autumn. And one iconic New England food that I just want to mention here, because I had never heard of this before. I'm originally from California, but I moved here. It's the fluffernutter. The fluffernutter is white bread, peanut butter, and a marshmallow fluff. I've had one. It tastes like how you would expect, maybe a bit better than you would expect, but it is an acquired taste. It is an acquired taste. So the last thing here I want to talk about is, are New Englanders friendly? Because there is kind of a reputation that this region is unfriendly. And in particular, Massachusetts was once ranked the 47th friendliest state in the United States, which is not great. There are 50 states, so near the bottom, really near the bottom there. And the kind of the culture here is to be very direct, very honest, you could say, honest to a fault, you might say, and to really speak your mind no matter what. So if someone's making you mad, they're going to hear about it in New England. But you shouldn't take any of that personally, and certainly if you ever come to New England, you will meet some of the nicest people you will ever meet. The reputation is just a hair unearned, in my opinion. And if you meet someone they're a bit abrasive, have a few drinks with them, and you'll be best friends by the end of the night. I guarantee it. So that is my kind of closing thoughts, and if you're interested in visiting New England, I highly recommend checking out the Verano or Invierno Puma courses through UNAM Boston. Here on screen I have the URL, boston.unam.mx. You can type that into your URL, or you can follow us on Instagram at UNAM Boston. Again, this has been Anthony Ochoa Fader, and I hope you've learned a little bit about New England culture.